Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Neil Hudson-Basing, and I am the Corporate Events Manager for London South Bank University. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today for the first of our series of LGBT plus History Month events for 2021. This event is entitled LGBTQ plus Thought Leaders Transforming Public Engagement, and we're delighted to have Mike Sarna here today. Just to talk you through kind of like how it's going to run, I'll do a quick intro on Zoom functionality and read out a statement. We'll then go over to Alan, who's going to do a bit of scene setting, and then Mike will give his presentation, and then there'll be live Q&A. I'm just going to read a short statement to you built around respect and dignity. Everyone speaking at or attending an LSBU event, whether in person or virtually, should be treated with respect, dignity, and courtesy. LSBU operates an environment built on equality, inclusion, and acceptance. We value contributions, feedback, and comments, and wish to create a space for sharing, learning, celebrating, and bringing communities together. LSBU does not tolerate any form of bullying, abuse, harassment, or discrimination. Inappropriate behaviour, including behaviour that potentially impacts or contradicts LSBU's reputation and values, will be treated seriously and acted upon. Anyone exhibiting any of this behaviour will also be removed from the webinar. We want our events to be an enjoyable and warm experience for all. Thank you for adhering to these guidelines. So, with that out of the way, we'd like you to use the chat box, share your thoughts and comments. We're keen to break down this virtual wall that we're all facing at the moment. When it comes to Q&A time, please feel free to pop your cameras on to ask a question, and I'll be supporting Mike with moderating the Q&A a bit later. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague, Alan, who is going to introduce today's event.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. So thanks everyone who's joining us for today's event. And in the next kind of 3 to 5 minutes, I'm going to just share 3 quick things. The first, I want to just be very glad. I'm very glad to be opening the LGBTQ Thought Leaders series on behalf of SONET and on behalf of London South Bank University. We've curated a series of very special guests, events, activities, talks, presentations, a real kind of variety of things that will span across the next 11 months. And we'll be announcing those events throughout the year. So still to come in February, on the morning of the 25th, we have Professor Emerita Raewyn Connell from the University of Sydney asking us what is a good university and what should the good university be doing. And next week, at the same time as today, our colleague Sansha will be in conversation with Phil Opoku-Gyima, who is the Executive Director of Kaleidoscope Trust and co-founder of UK Black Pride, to discuss the opportunities and challenges that we have with intersectional activism and solidarity. So people have contacted me about this event and the other events in this series to say, hey, I'm not LGBTQ myself, but this sounds interesting and I'd like to hear what they have to say. Can I come along? And I say, of course, absolutely. These events are organized with a conscious objective of breaking open some of the echo chamber effect that we often get with identity politics and particular communities. So it's a welcome to allies and to people who are maybe coming to an LGBTQ event for the first time as well. The themes and the topics are intentionally universal, while our guests' personal narratives and some of their examples and evidence and anecdotes might draw or will draw on more LGBTQ narrative. But our guests are leaders in their sectors, so we're very, very pleased to have them. The second thing that I want to kind of share with you, that was all one. The second thing I want to share with you is that February is Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, Queer and Questioning History Month here in the UK, and SONET is our London South Bank University staff network for LGBTQ plus staff and our allies. Why do we need a History Month, and why do we need a staff network? Well, these are questions that we're not going to have as the focus of our talk tonight, but I want us to remind ourselves that historically much progress has been made, but that progress has been unevenly experienced across our diverse communities. and in different parts of our nation, and has been stalled and has been reversed in many places around the world. So it's really important that we're bringing together our communities and our leaders and our ideas to collectively keep that progress moving forward. The third thing I want to do then is to take pleasure in introducing our guest tonight. Mike Sarna is an independent museums and heritage consultant supporting the development of public offers from interpretation and design to public engagement strategy, including working with communities. And I'll give you just a quick glimpse of his CV. He was the Director of Collections and Public Engagement at Royal Museums Greenwich. He was Head of Interpretation and Design at the Natural History Museum here in London, and Director of Collections and Senior Curator at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, amongst other achievements and accomplishments. So he's currently working with the Wellcome Trust, managing the Inspiring Science Fund, which is a £30 million fund for science centres across the UK. And I'll hand over to Mike. Thank you for joining the knowledge community here at LSBU and for opening our LGBTQ+ Thought Leaders series.
Well, thank you, Alan. It's fantastic to be the first of a series of people, and welcome to my kitchen, by the way. Always unusual to be presenting from your kitchen. And as I'm speaking, I'm pulling up my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, there we go. Thank you to London South Bank University, Alan, Neil, and all of you. I hope we have an interesting discussion. I'm going to be talking about rethinking public engagement, and just to say that not at all times will it have an LGBTQ focus, but I really think that it's about all audiences, public engagement. So it's a good sort of starting point, but I've tried to use as many LGBTQ examples as I can. So this presentation is really grounded in public offers related to museums. So my experience comes from museums, and here's the various museums that I have worked for over the year. Alan mentioned a few, but just to say many of them are science museums. So it's very interesting, you know, when you think of gay professionals, there's a stereotype sometimes that gay men populate art museums, but there's a few of us that are also working. And I'm going to give you a fair amount of examples from my career. And I've had a little part in some of those examples, but I want to say that there's a whole team of incredible professionals that underpin a lot of these. At any time, if you're interested in detail of these projects, I'm happy to make connections in the future. And Alan mentioned I work for the for the Wellcome Trust part-time, managing the Inspiring Science Fund, and Wellcome, of course, public health. During this past year, it's all been about reflection, hasn't it? We've all been reflecting on our performance and what we do in terms of public engagement. So part of my presentation is about that reflection of past performance, but a little bit of it too is provocation. And I'm hoping to provoke a response from all of you. And hopefully you will come back with some questions. I have an image of the Natural History Museum because the Natural History Museum was their moniker was the voice of authority of the natural world. And I really hated that. I hated the use of authority, but there is something about sort of having that firm base of facts that you have some skills related to a profession. And I say I do have some authority and knowledge of the museum profession, but I don't want to be authoritative. So this hopefully is a very open discussion. So it is about effective public engagement for everybody. And what I'm going to be talking about is what is it? What is effective public engagement? Why is it so important? How it gets done, and who is it really for? And I thought I'd throw in a real sort of personal element to this, and talk about the pitfalls and the barriers and the trials and tribulations. And so that LGBTQ A plus perspective. And I've highlighted the G because I identify as a gay man, he, him, and some of those perspectives may have a more of a. So for me, effective public engagement is about transformation. And the first case study I'd like to talk about comes from the Nature Museum in Chicago. We decided to do an exhibition called Crime Scene Insects, which was about forensic entomology. And forensic entomology is all about when somebody dies, and they may die out in the wood or out in a house or anything. The first witness is usually an insect. And so we decided to do this really interesting exhibition about forensic entomology, and we decided to, talk about it. This is basically what happens is the first witness to a death is usually a fly, and a fly lays an egg, and it goes through various instars and becomes a cocoon and goes through complete metamorphosis and emerges as a fly, and then the life cycle goes over. And you can tell the time of date of a death by these various instars, the evidence that is on the body. So we decided to do this exhibition called Crime Scene Insects. And we were very lucky to have the father of forensic entomology in Chicago. His name was Dr. Bernard Greenberg. And we said, Dr. Greenberg, what do you basically do in forensic entomology? And he said, well, what we do is we take a dead pig and we put it in a cage and we set it out in the middle of the woods, and we just watch the insects come, and we record when they come and their various life cycles in order to support dating when a death occurs. And so for this exhibition, that's what we did. We basically put a pig on display. We actually had 6. We put them out every 2 weeks. And we had them on the lawn of the Nature Museum. And you can imagine we got incredible press for this, and it was worldwide about this. And when we were doing the exhibition, a woman was out in the courtyard where this was, and I saw her, and she was sobbing. And of course, when you see somebody crying, you have to go over to them and support them. And you say, I know this is very difficult. Is there anything I can do? And she says, well, I'm not crying for what you would think. I actually drove 7 hours. I heard about this exhibition. My daughter heard about this exhibition. And I see her digging around for maggots in the ground. And I'm just realizing that she's going to be an entomologist. So there was this incredible transformational moment for this mother and daughter. So for me, transformation and effective public engagement, it's not always about knowledge-based outcomes, but emotional, and that you're trying to create these special moments and moments that people want to share. And people sometimes think that museums are encyclopedias, but they really are not. They're places of inspiration, and they allow people to get inspired and take their learning further. Of course, I was not allowed just to put these dead pigs out on the lawn of the Nature Museum. There has to be a culture and organizational culture that allows for this to happen. And I often refer to it as a yes-if culture. And my director then said, when I announced to him that we were going to do this, he said, well, I'm not going to say no. I'm going to say yes if you adhere to all the questions about health and safety. Now, and he also said good questions about, we don't want to kill pigs for this exhibition. So we had a relationship with a farmer. We gave a farmer a a freezer, and when there were stillbirths on the farm, we froze those pigs. So we did all these things to make sure that we had an effective health and safety adhere to this, but it was a yes-if approach. But the funny thing is, I use this example a lot when I talk about effective public engagement, but is it really enough? And this is really sort of talking about now and who gets to choose the topics that we talk about, who gets to steer the conversations that we are getting into now. And are we doing public engagement fast enough in this very fast-changing world? In my career, I've always tried to do interesting LGBTQ. There's always seems to be excuses why you can't do that. And my next example comes from Royal Museums Greenwich, where I was the Director of Collections and Public Engagement. I set the program for the National Maritime Museum, which included really big, large special exhibitions. The first exhibition, one of the exhibitions that I put forward that we really wanted to do was called Rum, Sodomy, and the Lash. And that comes from a quote from Winston Churchill, who said, "The only traditions of the Royal Navy are rum, sodomy, and the lash." And we thought it was a really fantastic exhibition. Rum is about reward. The lash is about punishment. A lot of our employment law really stems from naval, any types of naval strikes and strife. So very, very interesting subject. But of course, in between those two words is sodomy. Of course, that was very interesting. What is happening below decks? And what is happening on the shore? So we really wanted to do an exhibition that wasn't exclusively about sodomy, but was about sexuality. And it was very interesting when put this forward as an exhibition topic. You could see the curators of the National Maritime Museum sort of saying, how are we going to politely not make this happen? And one of the things that they did was they said, well, Mike, for effective exhibitions, you have to have things. You can't just have empty cases. People can't go through exhibitions of nothing. We have built a wonderful collection. Fortunately, this may be a very interesting topic, but we just don't have objects to support it. So really finding ways, there's always, within organizations, finding ways not to do things. And the reality is finding those excuses means that you often pursue what you have, great representation of, which, in this case, my gosh, we have so much Nelson material, and you become sort of a one-trick pony of types of themes. What we did was we decided to look at, we had an incredible collection of busts in our collection, but you can imagine they were all of white men. And we decided to work with communities to create our own set. And this is the artist Eve Shepherd, who worked with 3 sets of communities to commission some new artworks. And these are maquettes that were produced. I mean, this is just amazing in itself. This is Action for Refugees in Lewisham. This is a migrant community, and they communicated what they wanted within these busts, and then Eve Shepherd created a final version of the bust. This is the collaboration with the Girl Guides, a very sort of heroic bust. This is the Actions for Refugees in Lewisham, of course, the migration crisis. She rides on this wave, and there's these boats that you can't really see sort of underneath. In her headdress, she has pepper spray, so people violently, trying to keep people away. But the one really sort of interesting, they're all very interesting, was Mermaids UK. And Mermaids UK is an organization that helps gender diverse kids and their families. So I really love this bus because what they wanted was not a male or a female. They wanted a bit of an androgynous representation and this sort of beautiful human being emerging from the sea, almost flying up out of the waves, which I think was really incredible. And here the busts sit within what we have a lot of are those busts of white men, but we also decided to include figurines of everyday sailors and women to make sure that there was a robust discussion, that there was a greater representation across the board. So for the museum, it was about creating a strategy. Our strategy was about removing barriers to make the museum more accessible, creating community ownership, representing invisible histories, and collaborating to create a social and inspiring space. But looking, again, this is this time of reflection. And I think, oh my gosh, you have these individuals, white men, and then you have these busts represent communities. Is there something about othering that is going on? Is it tokenistic? You know, is it the right representation? Of course, these are really wonderful pieces. I don't ever regret doing this, but there are questions about how we put these things out on display, how they are interpreted. And also to say, when you put together a strategy, especially at a national, my gosh, it took 4 years to get this done. It was absolutely exhausting. And when we go back to sort of saying, oh my, you know, these themes that are emerging, Black Lives Matters, trans rights, climate change, all these themes, are we going quick enough? And recently at Wellcome, I was asked to interview Florence Schechter from the Vagina Museum. And what I found really sort of interesting is you have individuals that can't wait any longer. They are not seeing their representation in museums, in national museums, in local museums. So they're taking and producing their own museums. And I find it absolutely amazing and inspiring that there's this incredible determination. And what they really want to, they are the most open of public offers because they present dissent, they present conversation. They are really wanting to engage in an active dialogue with their guests. So what is the most effective approach for public engagement? Is it digital? Is it working with communities? Is it a theatrical approach? Is it museum? And that gets me to my next case study, which was an exhibition that I worked on at the Natural History Museum, where I was the head of interpretation and design. And that's sexual nature. When I proposed this exhibition to the directorate, they immediately were intrigued because, you know, of course, you know, sex powers biodiversity, and it's very important. But what I said is I wanted to make sure that human sexuality was part of this exhibition. And that's where it became very difficult for the Natural History Museum. It's very funny, the Natural History Museum, they don't see us humans as natural. They see us as sort of, you know, apart from the natural world, that we work in modified ways, and so we are not sort of a natural system. So it became a bit of a conflict. I was asked to leave the room, and I thought, oh my gosh, this exhibit is not going to happen. It did happen, but what happened was the director had said, you're going to have everything approved by just about everybody. So it was very hard to do dynamic content when you had to jump through, you know, hoops leading all the way up to the director. The director was so concerned about the reputation. It all stemmed really from this section, the last section, which was about human sexuality and the sexual.
Sorry, Mike, we lost you for a sec there.
Okay, do you hear me now?
We can, yeah.
So so sometimes exhibitions are not the best mechanism for public engagement. And for Sexual Nature, I think it's the learning team that was the amazing heroes. They took the subject and they ran with it. They did programs for children. This is snail sex. So snails shoot love darts at each other. So here they are on the front of the Darwin Center. But also these were the most attended and most actively engaged public offer components we had for adults. Natural History Museum was a family friendly museum, but we had incredible amounts of adult engagement. So what is the best approach? And you know, there is something about, you know, what do audiences really want? And I just wanted to talk about audiences and LGBTQ plus are an audience, but one audience that we worked at the National Maritime Museum was audiences. And I asked them, I said, well, are we doing a good job for you in representation across the museum? And they said, you know, Mike, you do, but it's gosh darn depressing. It's all about slavery, and it can seem very, very negative. And one of the things that the Caribbean Social Forum said is we wanted to see much more sort of balance of celebratory against the negative aspects that are represented in public offer. It's very important to talk about slavery, but it's very important to talk about, you know, how we have benefited from things like Windrush, for example. So there's something about looking at our public offer and turning up the volume in areas and turning down the volume and in other areas. And when I reflect, looking back at the National Maritime Museum, it's something about rebalancing. We put people like Nelson up on these pedestals, and we forget that they had some difficult things in their past. Nelson was a slave owner, for example, and nowhere in the exhibit that I helped produce in 2013 do we talk about that. We only talk about the heroic elements of Nelson, but we never really talk about the negative aspects. So there is this sort of, as you go through some of these public offers, especially in Britain, where white people are almost these heroic figures, and then you see people of color in sort of these areas of subjugation, which is very the National Maritime Museum, to their credit, have recently tried to abate this, but they got incredible criticism, just like, you know, the whole thing with Churchill recently and the statue. So it's something that they are talking about, is about sort of rebalancing the offer. Here's, I thought I'd put together my delivery philosophy for you, and this might provoke some discussion too, this is some delivery values that I sort of this. So there's something about our need to manage risk. It's a natural tendency, and we're such a risk-averse society, but actually we should be looking for risk in sometimes in our public offer. It's what makes public offers interesting. For a transformation to happen, you have to accept uncertainty, including discourse. It is a very difficult thing to deal with transformation, making that emotional response. There's something about being agile, participatory, cross-disciplinary, as being open and conversational in the public offer. And there's a need to define culture more broadly across our public offer. I think, again, we have these assets, these materials that sort of speak to certain narratives, and that really, we need to find ways into opening up conversations with a broader segment of society. There needs to be a greater distribution of authority. It's great to hear from non-experts. We have this in a lot of museums as sort of curators, but it's great to hear from communities, non-experts, which often have the most interesting perspectives about subjects. I like to think of museums as greenhouses for new approaches, new mindsets. So this is where the discussion really happens. And at all times, we in museums need to be credible messengers. We need to be sincere and continue to invest in segments, audience segments. There needs to be a willingness to break free from convention and do surprising public offers. And the last thing is sort of the question I have in reflection is I always told my staff when we did something really difficult, I'd say, okay, we're going to apologize later. For example, when we did the bus with Mermaids UK, it was very convenient that they were called Mermaids UK, in that when I had to communicate this to trustees, and I would say, oh, we're working with Girl Guides and we're working with Action for Refugees in Lewisham and Mermaids UK. But I didn't really tell them that we were working with a gender diverse children's group. And I think if I would, that bust would not have happened, and that would have been a shame. So I took this this approach, and I've used it over the years, and I said, we're going to apologize later. We're going to say, oh, sorry, we didn't clearly communicate. But I think there's a lot of tension in that, and I do want to give a last example of some tension when you apologize later and what can happen. This is when I was at the Nature Museum in Chicago. We did an exhibition called Stamps of a Different Nature, which was the artist Michael Thompson and Michael Hernandez de Luna. And they did these fantastic stamps that were sort of commemorating in a mock way things like invasive species, or they would talk about the crisis of rhinoceros, you know, being dehorned, and things like that. These stamps are considered currency. So of course, they were in trouble with the feds in the States because they were doing counterfeit activities. So we knew there was little problem there. And also they were quite, you know, whereas we were doing stamps of the natural world, they did some very subversive things. We didn't do a commissioning project. We did the selection of existing works, but they decided to do their own work during this time, and they produced this stamp. This is 2002, and it was called Food Flavored Anthrax. And this envelope shut down the Chicago U.S. Postal Service sorting facility in Chicago for 7 hours, and 500 people were sent home, and some were put on Cipro. The anecdote for. There is something about this sort of apologize later approach, is that we really should at all times be transparent, and we should have assurance that our boards are supporting us in this type of. You can see all different types of, you know, issues of where things can go wrong. This is in Elephant and Castle, when they decided to take of a knockdown council flat and turn it into a pyramid, and, you know, people's tears and sorrows turned into some. And then there's some, you know, interesting ones. I don't know where you feel, but there's a lot of backlash on the Maggie Hambling sculpture of the suffragette, and it'd be interesting to hear people's perspective on that. And then if you don't necessarily robustly engage with artists, sometimes the delivery cannot be as fruitful as it can be. This is an example at the Natural History Museum. It's called Tree of Life, which is a representation of evolution. And I would say it's a very dull representation of evolution. It's so much more interesting than just a cross-section of a tree. Our scientific staff would say evolution is much more dynamic than the stereotypical tree of life. So there is this question of, what is the immediate response when you use things like art, or is there a legacy response there? Are you going for a long game in terms of public? So for me, I'm gonna just end it right here, and I say it's very simple what effective public engagement is. And it is really about supporting your staff at all levels and nurturing bravery in new types.
Thank you so much, Mike. So we will go over to questions shortly. So if you do have a question, please pop your camera on shortly. Mike, I have a question. If you're happy for me to ask one, to start off with, you talked about how museums, and I love this quote. Museums are not encyclopedias; they're places of inspiration. As we move to a more virtual world, how do you think museums will fare in that? And do you think that they'll always have a place?
I think there'll always be a place, because there is something, about that sort of tangible object and the real, and I will also say, in an age of technology, my gosh, I'm almost looking forward to public offers that have a Wi-Fi free zone, turn off the phone. Sometimes I think our digital engagement is to our detriment. I would often see kids walking through, or tourists walking through the museum and not actually looking and engaging with things. More documenting their experience, or thinking that they take hundreds of pictures and just sort of walking away. And I will always say the face-to-face component of museums, I always feel, are the most successful. Putting text on the wall, putting things in cases, is often difficult. You cannot really get into all the nuances of the discussion. So I'm always really favoring the face-to-face component.
Thank you. If anyone does have a question that you'd like to ask, please do pop your camera on and we'll come over to you. One thing you also talked about, Mike, was that rebalancing of the past, and you talked about it when you talked about kind of like Black Lives Matter, and we see it a lot in LGBT issues. We see it a lot in climate and sustainability, and there's a tendency to focus on the negative, the struggles, the challenges, rather than the celebratory. So those success stories, the achievements, Black excellence, all that sort of thing. Do you think that is an issue with engagement generally?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult if public offers were to turn into all the public discourse. Just think, oh my gosh, we'd avoid them like the plague. There is something about celebratory aspects. And those aspects can have discourse within them and bring you into even a positive state. So they don't always have to be these negatives. They can move to a real sort of positive discussion. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Alan, did you have any questions?
I probably have a dozen questions, and I'll ask one of mine first, but there's one in the chat from John. John, I don't know if you want to ask the question yourself or if you want us to ask it for you.
Well, I'm happy to ask it. I actually have another question for Mike, which is about his teapot collection behind him on the shelf. I'm just wondering, are they allocated to different types of tea? But you can answer that one at leisure. But yeah, my question is do you think the museums should remain neutral?
I think it's really important that there is an aspect of neutrality to museums. The starting point of a conversation is always neutrality. But when you work in science museums, I really struggled at times, because there were times when people sort of question evolution, and they say, well, evolution is a theory, you know, and you know, so it's, you know, and you know, there's all these sort of creation museums, and as a museum of natural history, you do have to take, you know, stances. There was a controversy, I think, at the Science Museum Group years ago, where they were talking about climate change, and they were really trying to take this neutral stance, and I think it's, you know, slightly ridiculous and ingenuous at some point, when there's so many facts and you are an organization based on science, that you have to go a little bit, you know, out on a limb in order to talk about things. And the second part is the teapots. Those are Hall's kitchenware. I have probably around 10 of them. My partner only allows me to put 4 out at a time. Actually, coffee pots. They're drip coffee pots. And you can
sorry.
eBay, and they're absolutely fantastic. And they're a sustainable way because you do not have to use filters. They're fantastic. Hall's kitchenware coffee pot.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you, John. Thanks, Mike. Lizzie, if we come over to you.
Hi guys, thank you so much, Mike, for your presentation. I guess I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things that you kind of, I guess, touched on around institutional risk and risk aversion. And just before I give my anecdote, like I'd like to say, like, I am an independent creative producer. I don't represent anyone. I'm speaking on behalf of myself. So a few years ago, I produced a season for Science Gallery London called Mouthy. And one of the commissions that we made as a part of that was called the Fellatio Modification Project, which for a university is quite a controversial titled project. And we had various things in place to ensure that, you know, there was certain sexual content that wasn't relevant for, or not relevant, sorry, wasn't appropriate to be giving people permission to enter without kind of consenting and things like that. But as part of this is like, you know, my practice is like kind of pushing the what ifs of like how we work with these commissions. And I managed to take over one of the dental school teaching labs within King's to run a workshop where people made their own retainer that then could be modified. That was inspired by the artworks. The artwork was by this artist called Kwang Yi-koo, who identified as a gay male, but was a qualified dentist and an artist. And so looking at the history of body modification within the gay community, and then looking at like democratization of access to kind of more advanced modifications and relating that to his sexuality. And so basically the workshop then became like this forum where people who approached this from different perspectives, whether it was like biohackers or people who identified as part of the LGBTIQ community, could come and discuss this like as like a making workshop. And like we knew why we were doing it, but I think it kind of, we were so excited by it that we kind of maybe forgot that we were part of a larger institution, King's. And the communications office like were understandably a little bit upset closer to the time when they realized that this was happening, although we had all the kind of like our lines are like, you know, why we were doing this, why this was an appropriate thing for us to do within the science gallery team. We didn't necessarily have that community with King's, but I would argue that if we communicated it to King's further, they may have shut it down. So I think like it was all fine in the end, and it was like we had like the most phenomenal press people that came and covered it, and it was by trusting the people who attended and trusting that they were, you know, adults. They had like some of the most like beautiful nuanced conversations. I think it's probably the bravest thing I've done within an institution, but like, you know, we try to fine line in terms of that risk aversion of like the larger institution that we're a part of. Like, and I'm not suggesting that like all of this kind of content needs to be done within these like very large organizations, but I guess I'd be interested to hear like what your perspective is on kind of pushing back against risk adversity within larger institutions, and whether anyone else that's attending today has any thoughts about how you navigate that.
Well, you know, it's always interesting because whenever somebody talks about a compelling program like you just did, or when I talk to Florence Schechter, these seemingly risky approaches, as soon as they're out there, people just applaud them, and they vote with the numbers. You know, Florence Schechter, when she opened the Vagina Museum, people were, you know, lined up queuing to utilize this content. People, when they see Vagina Museum, they know what they're going to get themselves into, and especially your program too, you know, and it's associated with a college. So this is a really adult audience. When we did Sexual Nature, we had parental guides before you went in the exhibition with sample content and labels. We had all types of preventative measures. Sexual Nature, by the way, won the best exhibition in the Museums and Heritage competition in 2012. And all of a sudden, when it won, that's when the director came back to me and said, "Oh, fantastic. We always knew it was going to be great." And what was also interesting, when it won, I was invited to sort of celebrate this with the trustees. And the trustees were really begging for this type of content. So they said, this is exactly what we wanted to see in the public offer. So in this case, it wasn't necessarily the trustees that were, I think, the issue. It may have been more the directorate that was worried about reputational risk. And it's always projecting this sort of reputational risk. And there's this great, I was watching a rerun of Graham Norton with Cher. Cher's mother gave the best advice: if you don't remember the controversy in 5 years, it doesn't matter, right? And so all the tension that you have built up, the negatives of your program, washes away, because what you delivered was absolutely fantastic. And hopefully what you will remember in the future are those fantastic aspects of your program. So well done, Lizzie.
It was amazing. Like, genuinely, like, we got some fantastic coverage and new scientists. You know, it's working with the Science Gallery. Sorry, I'm a little bit sick, so my brain is really foggy. Was really fantastic. And I guess, like, just to follow, I then went to Melbourne and produced Science Gallery Melbourne's first season. And it was interesting, again, with like a different community, which was the Indigenous community, because the first season was about blood. And obviously for various different Indigenous communities within Australia, there is, you often can't even say the word. And, you know, the link to kind of like its meaning within Indigenous cultures. So, you know, there are several interesting things. Like, I've had to put into practice like a lot of my own, like, come up with my own processes around how I navigate tackling what could be perceived as risky subjects in my practice. But I think, like, it has the opportunity to be like way more inclusive by trusting your audience. So yeah, like my whole practice is about, you know, what if, and opening up a question rather than delivering something, if that makes sense.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lizzie. John, hi there.
Hello there. I wanted to ask about how you gauge the impact of an exhibition in terms of engagement, because I kind of imagine that the visitor numbers are more based on the marketing success of campaigns around getting people there. So once they're in the museum, how do you assess the effectiveness of the engagement?
You know, we're really bad at assessing effectiveness in museum. You know, it's for special exhibitions, it'll be footfall, there'll be summative evaluation for programs. So we're seemingly good, but what we're not good at is sort of longitudinal studies about really what impact that makes over time. That example that I gave about the little girl who traveled to see the pigs. You know, I'm interested, did she become an entomologist? You know, what real effect did she have? But I will say there is something about this, you know, and I firmly believe about knowledge. It's very important to have these knowledge-based outcomes, but emotional outcomes are really important, because emotional outcomes are what stay with you over time. And there's a lot of studies within the museum community about the importance of emotional outcomes. When you have some type of trigger, emotional trigger, positive, negative, it can really stay for a long time. So that's probably not the best of answers, but best I can give you at this point.
That reminds me of my favorite quote from Maya Angelou, which is, you don't remember what people said or did, you remember how it made you feel, which I think is very true.
I love that you give Maya Angelou and I gave Cher.
Both amazing. We have a question from Jonathan. Jonathan unfortunately couldn't stay to answer it live. Hi Mike, thanks for an interesting talk. It makes me think how I can take more risks. Is there an example of an exhibition or idea which was refused and how you rethought it to be accepted?
Oh gosh, this is going to be a tough one. Rum Sodomy and the Lash is, what's really interesting about Rum Sodomy and the Lash is when we put together a 5-year program, and in order to sell it, because one of my jobs was always trying to sell it, make it happen, is I took it to the BBC. I took the 5-year program of all the exhibitions that we were going to do, and I tried to sort of, give it to them as a menu to see what resonated with them, because if you get a co-production with the BBC, of course, that's just a windfall for your exhibition. And what was interesting was Rum Sodomy and the Lash was the one that they were most interested in, but was the one that the institution really couldn't make happen. And what I will say is, I can't recall really a specific example to this, but what I tried to do was set a strategy for public engagement and how we approached our topics, and a component of that was working with communities. And I think that is a way for a big lumbering institution like a national in order to reach out to new audiences in difficult ways. So that is one approach, strategy. But like I said, it's a long game, and realization of some of these things, it's really quite unfortunate, that years later you're lumbering on addressing a topic when smaller platforms have already sort of discussed it to death.
Thank you. John, I know you're on camera now. You've put an interesting comment in the chat box, talking about kind of like retrying an idea. Do you want me to read that out for you, or you?
Is that my comment about it's a sin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just, I think there's a lot of people talking about the Russell T Davies series, It's a Sin. And there was a really interesting article about kind of the arc between Queer as Folk back in 1999 and It's a Sin now. But I was just fascinated to hear that even in 2019, 2020, Russell T Davies went to the BBC and got turned down from it. He went to ITV and got turned away. And in fact, it took 2 attempts to go to Channel 4. There actually had to be a kind of an organic change of the team at Channel 4 before Lee Morgan, the commissioning editor, would take it on, which I just found fascinating. This guy, this story master with such credibility as Russell T Davies and such an important topic, and still it had so much adversity getting onto air, and yet it's a critical and commercial success. I'm not going to put any spoilers because I'm aware that those of you that are watching every week, it hasn't finished yet.
I echo that, and just to say it is interesting how effective it is as a tool for public engagement, especially now that we are in the pandemic and you make these connections. I've only gotten through 2. I've had emotional breakdowns, and I think about loss in the community. I was at the Chicago History Museum at the height of the AIDS epidemic. There were 5 openly gay men at Chicago History Museum. 4 of them died of AIDS, including my boss, including Scott McPherson, who wrote Marvin's Room. movie with Meryl Streep in it. The loss, the incredible loss. And so it is so important, how these things get done, but it's interesting how they serve as this very effective public engagement piece, and how is that that series being used to open up conversations. You see things on The Guardian, but there are so many opportunities about lessons learned about our pandemic now from the AIDS crisis, and how we recover. I mean, it'll be very interesting to see how we recover and mourn the loss, 100,000 plus of our citizens that have died. And there's some very amazing and emotional responses from the AIDS crisis. So there's always something really to learn. And I hope that, I would call it a very effective form of public engagement. Is much more than just a television series, but a way to sort of discuss things wider.
Thank you. Alan, did you have anything?
I wanted to just jump in. There's a question from Elliot in the chat that hasn't been picked up yet. Elliot, did you want to ask your question, or do you want us to ask it?
I was like, hi, I can ask it. Mainly, I was just wondering if you got any advice for kind of advocating for LGBT kind of projects to institutions, because again, you said there's a kind of reluctance and kind of fear of risk. So yeah, I was just wondering if there's any kind of general consensus on advocating for that.
Yeah, I paint a bit of a negative picture, but I will say that organizations have really transformed, even in the short period. So there is always an avenue, a way in. And I will say at the National Maritime Museum, I'm very proud. There is, for LGBTQ History Month, there are an incredible array of online events that we've done. The organization during my period was the first museum to have gay families, LGBTQ families events. So specifically for families, because of course, our culture has expanded to have, families over the years. And now all those kids, what do those families do for activities? Do they go to, strictly straight events, straight family events? So there's opportunities. So I think all organizations are interested in that activity. And it's really just, they're so accessible now with Twitter and online, and it's just being brave and not being, knocking on the door and having the conversation, because I think they're really interested in listening.
And if I can follow up on that, then for my question, it's about something you said in your talk, which was about museums being a greenhouse and not just recording and reporting on what's happened, but to be a greenhouse for things to happen. And I can see Renee has made a comment. I don't know if you want to come in and ask it as a question or make it as a comment, Renee, about what we do at LSBU.
Yeah, I was just sort of thinking, I think what Mike had said about this idea of creating community ownership and collaborating to make these sort of social and inspiring spaces was just really important. I just thought, well, we're sort of really expanding a lot more at LSBU in terms of redeveloping our buildings in Southwark and moving to a new campus as well in Croydon. So how we can actually pick up on that and really start working with the communities there to be able to be more collaborative with them and actually make them much more dynamic spaces.
I think, one of the things, and a suggestion is, when we did the Endeavor Galleries at the National Maritime Museum, we worked with 36 groups in the development of those galleries, which was an incredible amount. And it's very interesting when you get experts and non-experts in the room. And in some respects, there is tension. You know, experts come from this era of authority and have, you know, a certain amount of gravitas, whereas, you know, non-experts can feel at times intimidated. But when you invest in the relationship over time, it's really interesting to see the sort of shared perspectives and how they manifest themselves in the public offer. And I'm very proud to have delivered curatorial exhibitions in the National Maritime Museum that are curated by non-experts. That, you know, that you have a view of an Afro-Caribbean community. Who better to comment on that community than the actual community instead of, but it's always good to have, you know, the experts alongside. So it is that sort of hand-to-hand collaboration, which is incredibly fulfilling.
Thank you. We've got a question from Charlotte. Charlotte, I don't know whether you want to ask this live or if you're happy for me to ask it for you. Cool. I'll go to the question. Charlotte asks, can I ask, the element of artistic presentation missing here is music, as opposed to exhibitions, installations, and visual projects. How do you compare conveying the fascinating projects you have discussed with how, for example, live theatre or staged opera or stage dance can project similar topics? Is there room to blend the fixed installation and the fluid dance music form more often? How can interdisciplinary better express intersectionality?
Well, I'm really proud when I was at the National Maritime Museum, when we were doing the public offer, what we did was we invited production teams in to look at our collection and look at it in new ways. And one organization that got interested in us was Punch Drunk. So we did the largest museum theatrical production, Punch Drunk production. We had close to 40,000 people go through that at the National Maritime Museum. It was for children. It was called Against Captain's Orders. So it's very interesting. And this is what creative practitioners that are outside your discipline can do, is they can take your narratives and look at them in very sort of different ways and really turn them on their heads. We, as sometimes curators, are constrained by the content. We have to sort of write in a scholarly way, or, you know, the curators tend to, but musicians and dancers are freed from that. So we created an artist in residence program. Many museums have that, but we created a studio within the museum. And we made sure that that studio, the artist was actually engaging with audiences. So at all times, the exhibition was called Rethink, and we worked with a choreographer in residence, a digital artist, a print artist, a sculptress, a poet. So Karen McCarthy-Wolf, whose family was part of the Windrush generation, did poetry, and she did not just poetry on migration related to Windrush, but all the communities that were coming into the National Maritime Museum at that time, which was absolutely amazing and inspirational. So yes, Charlotte, you know, musicians, it's so important to bring out those, bring in those creative practitioners, because they can bring incredible life and new perspectives to a public offer.
Thank you. There are two more questions in the chat box, but John Baker, I know you've got one in there. Would you like to ask that live?
Yeah, sure. I can't believe it's already a year ago, but I attended this amazing event at the Queen's House in Greenwich for Lesbian and Gay History Month last year, which had a whole evening of amazing drag performances and all sorts of things. I remember dancing with the Pearly Queen of Greenwich at one point, and it was just such a fabulous evening. And it just made me. I remember talking to someone on the way home on the tube saying, I feel that these events in museum and gallery spaces really make you connect with things differently, and I think it's encouraged new people to go. And I just wanted to ask whether or not that kind of event planning is something that happens after the exhibition is planned, or is it sort of something that you now think about and integrate in terms of how exhibitions sort of are brought into life?
So we, 2016 was the anniversary, the 400th anniversary of the creation of the Queen's House. And we had a whole delivery style for the Queen's House. We called it classic with a twist. So the Queen's House has this sort of classic Indigo Jones architecture. And then we wanted to, at all times, turn it on its head. And you can see that reflected in the artwork, the juxtapositions. So it isn't as maritime-y and old white guy as it could be. And the public offer program was certainly that. And you had an incredible experience. I was so nervous at those events because they were so vivacious and so energetic. I was so worried, because we had this public art collection. I was so nervous. But the team, this is what is, again, this risk-averse type of thing. At all times, my worry was abated by the incredible diligence that team, my team, took in order to ensure the safety of the floors, the architecture, and the paintings. And so I know that you had a safe experience, but at all times, there is that sort of, again, we have to check that risk-averse approach at the door.
Thank you. And then we've got one question in the chat box, and that's from John O'Donoghue.
Yeah, me again. Mike, how confident do you feel museums and institutions are at what I'm kind of terming audience exchanges? And by this, I mean where they may have like stalwart supporters who feel like they financially prop up the museum, but potentially their unevolved views may hold riskier programming back. And I'm thinking of an example where the National Trust back in 2017, as part of the 50-year anniversary of the partial decriminalisation of homosexuality, had a lot of programming across various sites, which faced a big backlash from, I should say, some volunteers, some members, and some supporters. But it also attracted a new audience and a new membership, which included members of the queer community, but not just those people. It was people who wanted to see more, a more variety of stories told. How do you feel about where there's a risk of alienating and potentially even pushing away your traditional supporters, but the potential to get more? Do you feel that museums and institutions are kind of managing that balance, or that swing between one audience and another?
It's probably why I never become a museum director, because they carry that on their back, the financial burden. And I will say, it's easy to talk from, because I can say this very, I don't know, enlightened view where I can say, well, funders should never have, and it's absolutely true, have editorial control over content. And there should be, anything, the public offer should go through, and trustees should be involved in the production of the public offer. But if they're worrying that funders are not going to fund because of certain exhibitions, or programs, I think that's really wrong. And ultimately what it does for the brand of a museum, the brand becomes very stagnant and stale and not dynamic, and that is not fundable. I mean, National Maritime, what I'm very, very proud of my team at the National Maritime Museum, especially because of all those history topics, we have turned them on their ear. And I think when you go to the Queen's House, which has a lot of historical and art narratives, and National Maritime Museum, it has really grown, and that grows the brand and attraction to audiences. You really do have to, it is a trick to, maintain that core audience while also reaching out to new audiences. It's really so important to reach out in dynamic ways.
Yeah, interesting. And I think it's something where when I think back to, I think it was 2010, when Historic Royal Palaces did the Enchanted Palace at Kensington Palace, which, you know, was this really kind of theatrical presentation of the building site, basically. And for me, it was fantastic. And I was working in Cornwall at the time, and I did a study session with some of my team, and we went up and we did Kensington Palace, and in the morning, in the afternoon, we went to Hampton Court. And this is back in 2010, so I know that that's evolved quite a lot. But it was just amazing to see, same organisation managing both of them and two such different audience offers. And I guess that places like HRP and the National Trust have that ability, is they've got many, many sites. They can say, do you know what, this is for those people, this is for that audience there, and that is the richness.
There is something about confidence with organizations, because, you know, the Wildworks production of Enchanted Palace, I resonated. It was absolutely wonderful. I adored it, and it's the whole reason probably why we invited Punch Drunk to come in. So I went over to Historic Royal Palaces, and I went to Kensington Palace and asked, you know, how did you get it done, and all that. But what I found really interesting was, you know, going into the offer blind with an American accent. So people thought I was an American tourist as I showed up for at the door. And the visitor operations people were apologizing. They said, oh, so, you know, you're not going to see Diana, and it's going to be crazy, you know, so, you know, before you plunk down your money. And I'm just like, you know, I'm in it. I'm here, you know, for it. And there is something about a confidence of an organization and across even your visitor services, when you take these dynamic projects and not be apologetic about it, say, this is fantastic, amazing public engagement. Do to walk through, you know, palaces with, you know, period settings at all times? Can't we mix it up at times? It needs to be done. So really sort of approach those topics with confidence.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our audience for all of your questions. Alan, I'm going to hand over to you.
Technology, great. Thank you so much, Mike, for what I think everyone likely agrees, I won't speak for everyone, but was an engaging talk and very provocative. You've certainly, not to be cliche, but left me with lots to think about, and I want to go away. I might be tweeting you on your Mike_Sarna handle that you never use, sending you questions. But if people have other ideas for events or speakers or thought leaders that you're aware of, then I'd like to, rather than direct my thanks to Mike at this point, to direct my thanks to the audience and say, these events really are about community building, and the substance of them comes from this co-production. So please let us know if you would like to nominate someone as a thought leader. And otherwise, thank you again, Mike, for so much to think about tonight. And I'll give it back to Neil to wrap us up.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Marie. Absolutely brilliant. I'm taking away better to ask for forgiveness than permission from that. And I have just popped in a link to all of our other events that are taking place as for LGBT History Month 2021 at LSBU. We've got some great speakers, as well as a spicy and sassy hit class from the Muscle Marys as well. So there's some fantastic events and speakers on offer, and do check out our What's On pages. That's all. We hope to see you soon. Thank you.